Welcome everybody to the Lynnfield Historical Society. I'm the president, Ron Sarro, and tonight we have a free raffle of Abby Chandler's book, Seized with the Temper of the Times. So I hope you got your name in there. We'll pull that at halftime. I just want to talk a little bit about the illuminations. Next month's program will be upstairs in the chapel, and we're going to have a speaker talking about the Minutemen that came from Lynnfield. And before that, we're going to have a candlelight vigil over at the cemetery. So what we're going to do is we're going to gather here upstairs, outside, and we'll walk over to the cemetery, and we'll have people dressed in black capes and tri-corner hats, and they will be holding a lantern. And I will play the town crier, and we'll have a couple speakers. Then I will read off the names and ring a bell for each of the soldiers who participated in April 19th, who are buried over there in the old burying ground. And as I read their names, we'll light a lantern at their grave and plant a flag, a regimental flag. Okay, so if anybody wants to be a lantern holder, we really need some people to volunteer to be lantern holders. We need about 16 of them, the 16 soldiers over there. And, you know, the soldiers did their part, so we should do ours here. Anyway, I want to thank the hospitality host tonight, Fran Richard, Diane Ruby, and organized by Janet Everson. I'd like you to sign up for the email if you want to leave your email address. And it will help if you like and follow us on Facebook also. And stay for refreshments afterwards. We'll have a little birthday party here for Linda, whose birthday was yesterday, and Diane, whose birthday was last week. And some sad news, Marge Potter passed away. She's a longtime member, and she came all these things. She's a wonderful person to talk to, and just a wonderful person. Okay, so tonight's guest is UMass Lowell Associate Professor of History, Abby Chandler, PhD, and she'll be speaking tonight on the topic of the Stamp Act and the events leading up to the American Revolution. Abby will be citing arguments from her new book, Seized with the Temper of the Times, in which she describes the similarities and differences in the reaction to the Stamp Act of 1765 between the Massachusetts colonists and as opposed to the other colonies such as Rhode Island and North Carolina. So please welcome tonight's speaker, Abby Chandler.
Can everybody hear me? All right, great. So thank you all for coming. And I'm going to be telling you about the research on the Stamp Act crisis that became part of my book, Seized with the Temper of the Times. And I'm actually going to start out my talk by starting out exactly where this book actually started for me. So if you can move up to the next slide. So this is a painting of a man named Martin Howard, and he was a Rhode Island colonist who lived in Newport, Rhode Island. In the summer of 2005, I was working on a PhD in history at the University of Maine. As many of you know, I've been interested in history since I was a kid. And I was assigned to do research on Martin Howard because the house that he lived in the 1750s and 1760s, is one of the houses in the collection of the Newport Historical Society. And at that time, pretty much all they knew about him was he'd owned this house, he was a loyalist during the Stamp Act crisis. And so they asked me to do more research on him for my intern project. And as I was starting to look into Martin Howard and who he was, you can go up to the next slide, I came across this passage of his in a pamphlet he published in 1765. Our personal rights, comprehending those of life, liberty, and estate, are secured to us by the common law, which is every subject's birthright, whether born in Great Britain, on the ocean, or in the colonies. And usually in the years leading up to the American Revolution, when we have people talking about the personal rights of life, liberty, and estate, the person we associate that with is, of course, Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. So finding a loyalist who is quoting that same life, liberty, and estate that John Locke had laid out in the 1600s was one of the things that made me interested in Martin Howard, because if he's quoting life, liberty, and estate, he's a loyalist, and Thomas Jefferson will do have life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and he's a patriot. What is going on with all of this? And so that was my starting place with Martin Howard. Now, if you go up to the next slide, this is a picture, by the way, of the pamphlet that he published that remark in. So way back in 2005, I had a loyalist quoting John Locke. That was pretty much what I knew about Martin Howard. And along the way, I went on researching Martin Howard. And if you can go up to the next slide. And all of this eventually became a book, Seized with the Temper of the Times, Identity and Rebellion in Pre-Revolutionary America, which looks at identity and rebellion in pre-revolutionary America, and it's particularly focused on political rebellions from the 1760s. And I found that decade particularly interesting. We're very familiar with political rebellions in the 1770s leading directly into the revolution, but I was curious about, okay, what's going on in the decade before? So that is really what I'm going to be talking about this evening. And one of the core elements of my research was the Stamp Act crisis. And I'm going to start with some background information. Okay, what was the Stamp Act? What was this thing? So I'll have you go to the next slide. And in 1763, there was the end of this massive global war. Winston Churchill very famously called it the First World War. And it was called the 7 Years' War. Well, it took 7 years to fight it. And the part of it that was fought here in North America was called the French and Indian War, which is a little confusing because the war that was fought in North America was fought by French colonists allied with Native Americans who were fighting against English colonists who were allied with other Native Americans. But anyway, we call it the French and Indian War. So this war comes to a close at the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And Britain won the war, which you can tell as you look at this map. Anywhere you see orange is now British territory. So half of North America, there's some spots starting to show up in Africa, there's some spots starting to show up in India, and of course, as we get into the 1800s, it's going to be a lot more British territory. And from the viewpoint of the British Empire, this was great. They had won the war. They were the most powerful country in the entire world. It also came with a downside. If you can go to the next slide. The British Empire had borrowed money from bankers in Europe to fund the war. And they now owed 150 million pounds. And that's their money, not ours. They basically owe about $1 trillion. That's a lot of money. And it now needs to be paid back. So in a first effort to start paying down the war debt, John Stuart, Lord Bute, who is the Prime Minister of Britain that time, announces a tax on cider in 1763. And this is a tax on people who live in the West Country of England who are making cider. And this is hard cider, by the way, not the sweet cider that we're more accustomed to here in the United States. Most people in the West Country, cider was their primary source of income. They were not happy. So if you can go to the next slide. So I'm showing you this image for a number of reasons. One, it gives you a sense of just how angry people are with the cider tax in England. Two, it also gives you a sense of the ways in which, and this is something I'm going to go on talking about, people in the 1700s are using imagery as a way of making a larger political point. Because one thing to keep in mind, this is a time period in which literacy rates are relatively low. So if you're trying to reach a wide audience, you're going to have some text, which you can certainly see, but you're going to also have images. as a way of reaching people who will see this and put together that something is wrong. And if you look really, really closely, right here on that bonfire, you'll notice there's a drawing of a boot, because this was Lord Boot's tax. Therefore, they are roasting a boot as a metaphorical way of roasting him. And this does not go well for Prime Minister. He loses his job. He's then replaced by the next Prime Minister. And the next Prime Minister thinks, taxing people in England is really not working. Because if you tax people in England, they will have protests like this on my front doorstep. I think it might be a nice idea to start taxing people who live 3,000 miles away who are probably not going to come and have bonfires at my doorstep. So, next slide. Parliament will pass something that's called the Duties in the American Colonies Act. It's more commonly known as the Stamp Act on March 22nd, 1765. And the way this works is that colonists have to pay in money for paper documents to be stamped. And if your document wasn't stamped, it would not be official. So the example I give to my students is, okay, you're graduating from Harvard, the only operating university in Massachusetts at this time. And at the end of your 4 years of study, if your diploma was not on a piece of paper that had the official stamp, your diploma would be worthless, meaningless, nobody would recognize it, which would mean you'd done 4 years of labor for nothing. So that gives you a sense of how this works. Diplomas have to be on stamped paper, marriage licenses have to be on stamped paper, newspapers have to be on stamped paper. In some cases, like this one, it's a seal that gets pressed into the paper, a little like a notary. In others, and I'll have you go to the next slide, there are actual literal stamps. So this series of pictures here are of wallpaper from the Parson Barnard House in North Andover, Massachusetts, which is the town I live in, and the Parson Barnard House is just up from my house, up the street from where I live. And several years ago, they did a process where they were going back layer after wallpaper, layer after wallpaper, layer after wallpaper. So we've got 1750 wallpaper, and when they found the 1765 wallpaper, they found it was official, legally stamped, and they found the stamp buried there under all those layers of wallpaper. So that, again, gives you a sense of the utter extent to which the new requirements are going to be affecting people's lives at every single level. So that's what the Stamp Act is. We're now going to start turning to my more specific research on the Stamp Act. And I'll have you go to the next slide. And when we talk about the Stamp Act, we tend to talk about it as this universal thing. Stamp Act bad, colonists don't like it, protests, end of story. The thing I realized in the course of my research is how you experience the Stamp Act was entirely dependent to which colony you were living in and the political status of that particular colony. So I'm going to be telling you about what the Stamp Act crisis felt like if you were here in Massachusetts. Then we're going to talk about the Stamp Act crisis in Rhode Island. Then we're going to talk about the Stamp Act crisis in North Carolina. And I picked these three colonies for a number of reasons. Number one, my research was on Martin Howard, who's from Rhode Island, so I was naturally going to look at that. He eventually wound up living in North Carolina, and the second half of my book looks at a political rebellion in North Carolina that he also gets swept up in. And then also going to look at Massachusetts, and Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and North Carolina are a really good way of looking at, okay, how does the Stamp Act feel on the ground? Because they're excellent examples of the different ways that this could go. So first I'll talk about Massachusetts, then I'll talk about then I'll talk about Rhode Island, then I'll talk about North Carolina. In each case, I'm going to start with telling you what is going on with the colony politically, and then we'll talk about how they respond to the Stamp Act because those two things are extremely tightly entangled with each other. I have a habit of talking with my hands. Okay, so next slide, please. Massachusetts in 1765. It's a royal colony. We have not always been a royal colony. When Massachusetts was founded in 1630, we were a charter colony. I'll explain what a charter colony is shortly, but by the time of the Stamp Act, Massachusetts had become a royal colony. That happened in 1691. I can answer more questions about that later if anyone's curious. If you are a royal colony, your governor is appointed by the crown. Your legislature is locally elected. With a caveat that, and this is a caveat that is true of all the colonies, you have to be white, male, and own property to vote or run for office. So we have local government, but it's local government of a relatively small portion of the overall population. So that is how Massachusetts enters the Stamp Act. And next slide. And because they're entering this with, there are the officials in the colony who are officially appointed by the crown, and there are the members of the legislature who are locally elected. Not surprisingly, the officials appointed by the crown are going to support the Stamp Act, because if they didn't support the Stamp Act, they lose their jobs, and they like their jobs. But the legislature are largely opposed to the Stamp Act. So here in Massachusetts, this is setting up this tussle between a royally appointed governor and lieutenant governor and a locally elected legislature. So some of our core players. We have Governor Francis Bernard. We have Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchison. We have Stamp Tax Master Andrew Oliver. And Andrew Oliver happens to be Thomas Hutchison's first cousin. This is how he got his job. So Governor Francis Bernard is responsible for running the colony. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchison is responsible for helping him run the colony. And Andrew Oliver is responsible for being the person who actually handles the processing of the taxes, or of the Stamp Act. And, as I mentioned, the Massachusetts House of Representatives is opposed to the Stamp Act, as are many Massachusetts colonies. So this is the tug of war we're setting up. Bernard and Hutchison say Stamp Act good, and House of Representatives says Stamp Act bad. And Andrew Oliver is kind of stuck in the middle because he's the guy who has to actually make you pay for the taxes on the stamps. So things start to fall apart in the summer of 1765. There's been a lot of talk, there's been a lot of comment, there's been a lot of columns in the newspaper, but things will get ugly in August. And I'll have you go to the next slide. So on August 14th, 1765, an effigy of Stamp Tax Master Andrew Oliver is hanged in Boston, more specifically in Newbury Street. And an effigy is a very popular way of voicing frustration at this particular time period. And this goes back to that point I made. A lot of people can't read or write. Images are a good way of appealing to them. So to make an effigy, you basically create a scarecrow, dress it up, stick some labels on it saying, this is so-and-so, and do bad things to it. And if you look really carefully, you're going to find Andrew Oliver effigy here, but what is hung on the other side of that tree? A boot. Now, the British Prime Minister who pushed this through was not Lord Bute, but Lord Bute is associated with the cider tax and is associated with enforcing taxes. So by hanging the boot, this is a way of saying, hey, the cider tax was also not okay, everyone. And that is the reason why I included that image earlier. So they have the effigy of the Stamp Tax Master, but then 12 days later, things are going to get really ugly. Next slide. This is when you have the full-blown Stamp Act riot breaking out August 26th. And so again, you could see we have effigies, we have liberty caps, and this is a crowd that gathers on Boston Common. They're roaring through the streets of Boston. Next slide, please. Another thing that happens is Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's home was attacked later that night. It's one of the things I find interesting is Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson was more of a target than Governor Francis Bernard. It's not that they have more respect for the governor's position than the lieutenant governor. It's that Thomas Hutchinson was a lot more combative. And so this is the reason why you have so many colonists angry with him. And so there's this mob of people who attack his house, throw stuff out the windows. You could tell from this drawing. Agonizingly, from a historian's perspective, Thomas Hutchinson was writing a 3-part history of New England, and a lot of his documents got burned. And as a historian, that's rather heartbreaking. So, things eventually calmed down in Massachusetts, but the point has been made. So we are going to jump now to Rhode Island. And next slide. All right, Rhode Island, and for that matter, Connecticut, entered the Stamp Act crisis in a completely different position than any other British North American colony. They are the last 2 charter colonies. And being a charter colony means you get to elect your governor. You get to elect your legislature. And again, same caveats. You have to be white, male, and own property to vote or run for office. So as Rhode Island and Connecticut enter the Stamp Act crisis, we're not going to have the tug of war that we saw in Massachusetts and that we're also going to see in North Carolina of the governor is pro-Stamp Act, but the legislature is anti. Instead, in Rhode Island and Connecticut, the governor is anti, the legislature is anti. This should not be a conversation. However, next slide, please. Even as Governor Samuel Ward is saying Stamp Act bad, and the Rhode Island representatives is saying Stamp Act bad, there's this group of civilians in Newport, Rhode Island. And next slide, please. They call themselves the Newport Junto. And here's when my friend Martin Howard comes back into this story. The Newport Junto are a collection of men who live in Newport, and at this point in time, it was very common for groups who organized generally to advocate for various political causes to call themselves a junto. And Benjamin Franklin also organizes a Philadelphia junto around about the same time period. It's basically a way of having a place to advocate for the things you're passionate about. They had advocated for Rhode Island to become a royal colony in 1764. Again, as I said, Rhode Island is a charter colony. If you are a charter colony, you could still elect your governor. However, political battles over who was going to be the governor of Rhode Island were incredibly fierce, and it sets up this situation in which Samuel Ward campaigns to be governor, and then he gets defeated by Stephen Hopkins, and then Samuel Ward defeats Stephen Hopkins, and then you get the general idea. And it is the firm opinion of the Newport Junto that having one half of Rhode Island continually screaming at the other half as they keep electing one and then the other back to the governor's office is a bad idea. And the colony might be a little bit more stable if their governor is getting appointed. So they had been advocating for Rhode Island to become a royal colony back in 1764. Not surprisingly, a group of men who want Rhode Island to be a royal colony are also going to advocate in favor of the Stamp Act. And next slide, please. So here's Martin Howard back again. And this creates this unique, there is nothing else like what happens in Rhode Island during the Stamp Act crisis anywhere else in the colonies. because the royal governor is pro-Stamp Act, legislature is anti, is what we see in most of the colonies. Here we have a governor who's anti-Stamp Act, a House of Representatives who's anti-Stamp Act, but then we have a civilian group who are advocating for the Stamp Act. So this creates this very different dynamic where the battle is really much more happening on the streets of Rhode Island as neighbors are increasingly pitted against neighbors. And this leads to relations in Rhode Island just completely and totally collapsing late in the summer of 1765. However, the pattern of events around the Newport Stamp Act riots is pretty similar to what we saw in Boston. So, next slide, please. On August 27th, 1765, so this is the day after the Boston Stamp Act riots, effigies of Martin Howard, Thomas Moffett, and Augustus Johnston, who's the stamp tax master. And the reason why these three are getting effigies of them, Howard has been very passionately advocating in favor of the Stamp Act. He published that pamphlet I'd mentioned earlier. Thomas Moffett is also advocating in favor of the Stamp Act, and Augustus Johnson has agreed to be the stamp tax master. So he's up in that, up to his eyeballs. And so on the Newport parade, effigies of the three of them are hanged. For anyone who's familiar with Newport today, the Colony House is here, Washington Square is here, the brick marketplace down there is there, then the wharves and the waterfront are on the other side. The bit of green space that is today called Washington Square was called the Newport Parade in the 1760s because, of course, George Washington is not a thing yet, so nobody's naming anything for him. But it's the center of town. If you're going to hang effigies of people, that's where you're going to do it. So the effigies of the three of them are hanged there. At that point in time, Augustus Johnson basically recants and publishes a piece in the local paper saying, I'm sorry, I'll never, ever do it again. And I suspect the reason he did it is because he knew what was coming. And next slide. Later that night, both Martin Howard's house, here's his house, and Thomas Moffett's houses are attacked. We have a pretty graphic description of what this attack looked like. So there are mobs of men, they're breaking in the windows, breaking open the door. There's a description of throwing chains up around the chimney and trying to pull the house down. It was a well-built house. It did survive. But Howard and Moffett realized that they need to get out of town. And the two of them flee to London along with Martin Howard's daughter, Annie. And I mention her partly because she's a part of this story who tends to get forgotten. And also, there's just something really poignant and sad about 10-year-old Annie. Her mom had died the previous year. And the thing I'm never going to know is, what did it feel like to be 10 years old? Your mom just died the previous year. Men want to kill your father. You're fleeing in the middle of the night onto a naval vessel into the middle of Newport Harbor. And again, we don't have those stories, but there's something I've thought a certain amount. The very end of this attack, I'm going to come back to what happened next to Martin Howard, Thomas Moffett, and Annie Howard. Now, however, we're heading to North Carolina. So next slide, please. And on paper, North Carolina should have gone exactly the same way as Massachusetts because it's a royal colony. The governor is appointed by the crown. The legislature are locally elected with the usual white male-owned property to vote or run for office. And next slide, please. The governor of North Carolina, one William Tryon, did indeed support the Stamp Act, and the North Carolina General Assembly is opposed to the Stamp Act, like the House of Representatives here in Massachusetts and the House of Representatives in Rhode Island. The thing to know, however, about William Tryon is William Tryon is in a really weak place. He's a man who was a good soldier, but from a not great family. He rises up the ranks of the British military during the 7 Years' War. He has the excellent fortune to marry a woman named Margaret Wake, whose brother-in-law at that point in time is Lord Hillsborough, who's basically the Secretary of State who handles the British North American colonies. So, because William Tryon, poor man, good family, good military record, has married into a family that's connected with a prime minister who's in charge of the British North American colonies, this means that he has just gotten his job as governor of North Carolina in 1765. But if you're a man with no real connections of your own, who got your job because your wife happens to have the Secretary of State as a brother-in-law, you're entering your job in a position of weakness. It also didn't help that when Tryon first arrived in North Carolina in 1764, the previous governor, Arthur Dobbs, is still in place. Dobbs was supposed to retire on the spot. He refused. Tryon was basically left cooling his heels for 8 months. So, Dobbs dies of an I can never pronounce that, apoplexy. Tryon gets the job. Stamp Act breaks out. So, coming into a political crisis in which you are a royal governor who's very weak is not a great position to be in. And I'm going to talk more about what's going on with that. For the moment, however, next slide, please, we're going to talk a little bit about what the demonstrations aboard the Stamp Act look like. Massachusetts or Rhode Island are the only places where we see full-blown riots. All the other colonies have smaller demonstrations, and North Carolina is no exception. And the focus of these demonstrations is the stamp tax master, and that's something we saw before. Andrew Oliver has that effigy, and then Augustus Johnson also gets hanged in effigy. And so the stamp tax master, William Houston, there are various demonstrations against him in Wilmington, North Carolina, Cross Creek, North Carolina, New Bern in the fall of 1765. And this is a marker in Wilmington, North Carolina, marking where this happened. But rather than hanging him in effigy, what happened is William Houston comes into Wilmington to pick up his mail. He's from an outlying farm, and he's met by a mob of men who say, "Hey, we hear you're the stamp tax master. Would you like to turn down that job and we won't do bad things to you?" And he says, "Absolutely. I resign on the spot." And there's this lovely account, next slide, please, and this is from the North Carolina Gazette. He comes in, they say, "You can resign and it'll be fine. You cannot resign and we can do bad things to you." He says, "I resign." They basically lift him up on their shoulders, carry him around Wilmington, hold a bonfire, everyone gets drunk. It's a great party. And William Tryon, governor who, as I mentioned, is already in a bit of a weak spot, looks at this event and realizes, okay, there's a certain level of levity here, plus I need to make friends with my legislature. So, and this is unmatched anywhere else in the British North American colonies. The next slide, please. He invites members of the North Carolina General Assembly to his home on November 16th, 1763. He's basically negotiating. Okay, I could appeal to Parliament for an exemption from the Stamp Act for North Carolina on the grounds North Carolina is a poor colony. This will be a financial burden for all of you, so I will write and ask Parliament not to apply it here. Parliament tells him to get lost, not surprisingly. And if this doesn't work, To quote Tryon, I will cover the whole duty arising on any instruments executed on stamped paper on which I should have any perquisite fee. In short, if there are any, because some of the stamp tax duties go directly to the governor as payment for his services, and he is saying, if there's any stamp tax in which the payments would go directly for me, I waive the payment. So the stamp will officially be there, will be legal, but I will not be financially benefiting for it. Please, guys, can we make a deal here? And the General Assembly refuses these offers. They do not want to make a deal. But as we get into the late fall of 1765, things are calming down. Number one, there's growing arguments that the violent demonstrations in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and the moderately violent demonstrations in the other colonies may have hurt their case because it makes them look like a bunch of violent radicals. So that's one thing that's going on. Another thing that's going on is there are people advocating in Parliament for the Stamp Act to be repealed. Benjamin Franklin, very famously, argues in favor of repealing the Stamp Act. And Parliament ultimately decides to repeal it. And next slide, please. So in March of 1766, Parliament says, okay, everybody, no more Stamp Act. And the colonies go wild with celebrating. And this is one of my favorite images of this period. It's a series of members of Parliament. If you look really carefully, one of them is holding a small coffin. And the official title of this engraving is The Death and Burial of Miss Anne Stamp. The Stamp Act didn't even get to have a first birthday because it was repealed even before it turned 1. So they are burying the little baby Stamp Act. And again, I find the balance of you're appealing to an audience who are literate. There is text in this, but you're also trying to appeal to audience who are illiterate. And so you find this constant balance of you're trying to speak to both sides. Now, the repeal of the Stamp Act basically has a footnote. That footnote says, okay, guys, we're repealing this. That doesn't mean we can't tax you. And a few years later, they will come up with the Townsend taxes, which tax D, and you know where that one goes. But for the moment, this is a great moment of triumph. The place, however, I want to end is with a letter written by Secretary of State Henry Conway to Rhode Island Governor Samuel Ward. I mentioned him earlier, March 31st, 1766. As I mentioned, Martin Howard, Annie Howard, and Thomas Moffat traveled to London, fleeing for their lives, in early September of 1765. And Howard and Moffat will both then testify about the Stamp Act crisis. And this, I started with a quotation of Martin Howard's that helps to explain what made me interested in this man. And this particular letter, I think, helps to explain why this is a man who I eventually wound up writing an entire book about. I must mention, says Secretary of State Henry Conway, one circumstance in particular which ought to recommend those unhappy people, and by that he means the Howards and Moffat, whom the outrage of the populace has driven from America, which is that unprovoked by the injuries they suffered, they gave their testimonies with knowledge and without passion or prejudice. And those testimonies had, I believe, great weight in persuading the repeal of the Stamp Act. So when Martin Howard and Thomas Moffat are testifying about the events of the Stamp Act crisis that led to them fleeing for their lives before Parliament, the thing they chose to focus on was the reason why their neighbors were unhappy about the Stamp Act. Rather than asking for revenge, they asked Parliament to consider the plight of their neighbors. They might politically disagree with their neighbors, but they felt their neighbors deserved to have a case made for why they were opposed to the Stamp Act. And again, that says a lot about Martin Howard as a person, and again explains why I spent so many years studying this man. One final last postscript. Annie Howard will eventually grow up and marry a man named Andrew Spooner. His grandfather was Andrew Oliver, Boston stamp tax master, and his great uncle was Thomas Hutchison. So Andrew Spooner, Annie Howard are next generation loyalists, and I continue to be interested in that marriage, so stay tuned.
Okay, so we're going to draw our raffle winner right now.
Fran Richard.
And I want to thank Abby. Abby didn't take a fee tonight. She donated her book. She's just the best person. You might remember her. She did the dollhouse talk last year, and hopefully we'll have her again. So if there's any questions, and I'll just start off with, it sounds like everything's okay after this. What happened? I mean, did things calm down in Boston?
They temporarily calmed down. There's a lull between fall of 1765, but then in 1767 you have the passing of the Townshend Acts, which is the taxes on, which is the taxes on paper, cloth, paint, glass, lead, tea, the big one. And things start organizing in Boston again. In 1768, you have the first wave of British soldiers being sent to Boston. Paul Revere has that very famous engraving showing them arrive, and they will go on sending more and more and more soldiers. This will eventually lead to the Boston Massacre. Eventually, protests against the Townshend tax on the tea are going to lead to the Tea Party. So there is a calm period in basically late 1765 into 1768, but it does not last long.
Thank you. Any questions from the crowd?
Abby, how about students taking history these days? Are there more students taking it, or is it still difficult?
So I teach two types of classes. I teach a general education survey, United States History to 1877, and that one is students from all over the university. But my experience has been the last couple cycles, I've had some excellent classes, and I definitely have a sense of urgency. We're in a really interesting political moment now. How did we get here? And so there's an energy that's been in my classes the last couple of years that I was not seeing, let's say, 7-8 years ago. I also teach upper level history classes. And one of the great joys of teaching history at UMass Lowell is we have this cadre of majors who are just the best.
Good to hear.
And their energy and enthusiasm are the thing that keeps all of us coming into work every morning.
Yeah. Let me bring the microphone.
Okay, I may not need it. when there was so much, as we moved towards the ultimate revolution, and there was so much differences of opinion in the colonies, especially the middle colonies and the South. Do you feel the Stamp Act had an influence in beginning to galvanize the movement towards ultimately the revolution?
I think it's a starting place. But I think one of the cautions that I make in my book is the people who are advocating against the Stamp Act in the 1760s are not advocating for leaving Britain. The goal is to improve the relationship, but not to leave. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. 1760s, everybody is still very much part of the empire, and I think that helps to explain why both Martin Howard Loyalist and Thomas Jefferson Patriot are drawing from the same body of writing. And one of the things I found really interesting in my research looking at political rebellions from the 1760s is often how similar these people sound to each other. So yeah, things are going to explode, but we are not there yet.
I have a question over here.
I don't know that.
Okay.
How big a burden was this tax? I know it's a tax, but is it a small thing and people are just perturbed because it's coming from England, or is it a real burden on the colony?
It's not a real burden. I think the problem is this. I mean, this is the start of the no taxation without representation argument. I think the bigger issue that is underlying the Sugar Act, which I didn't mention but predates the Stamp Act, and then the Stamp Act, and then the Townshend Acts, increasingly Britain is talking about using the money raised by these taxes to be used for cracking down on smuggling. And I think that's where the real anger comes from. It's one thing to be asked to pay taxes to help pay down that war debt. We benefited from Britain fighting the 7 Years' War. We benefited from Britain winning the 7 Years' War. It's another thing to ask people to pay money that is going to be used for prosecuting their smuggling activity. And that's a major driving factor in a lot of the coastal towns. You look at the Sons of Liberty chapters, the big movers and shakers in those chapters are all merchants who are directly affected by all of this.
We have a question here.
Did Great Britain put tax on the other colonies? And if they did, were they successful in that?
So the stamp tax was a tax on all the British North American colonies.
India and Africa and
So, okay, all right, I see what you mean. The thing to keep in mind is at this point in time, what Britain is doing in Africa and what Britain is doing in India are small trade outposts. You don't have large populations of colonists the way you do here in British North America. Now, there are endless efforts to get the British East India Company to pay up, but the British East India Company has the benefit of the fact that they are producing the cool stuff, including tea, that everybody wants. So the taxes are less of an issue in those places, largely because they're trade outposts rather than places where people are living and farming and running businesses. But the stamp tax was applied across the board. And there were also rebellions in the British colonies in the Caribbean. There are rebellions in the British colonies up in Canada. The loudest certainly are coming from New England, but they do exist all up and down the eastern seaboard.
Okay, do we have any more questions here? Okay, everybody, we have refreshments here, and if you can't stay, just grab some, wrap it up in a napkin or something like that.